Thank you. I very much appreciate it. Can everybody hear okay? Okay, good. All right. So this story is, yes, it's a story of a little bit of tragedy, but I hope that what comes out of this is also a story of resilience and hope. It's not just all about tragedy. So we're going to first start with a little bit of a geography lesson of New York. So this is the island of Manhattan. New York City is kind of a big, broad area, but Manhattan itself is an island that's separated by two rivers. The one that separates New York and New Jersey is called the Hudson River. The World Trade Center was down here, which was just about at the southernmost tip of Manhattan, and the Statue of Liberty is down here, kind of within eye shot. So zooming out a bit, that's where the World Trade Center is. There are a few ways to get in and out of the city. Since it's an island, you have to either take a bridge or a tunnel, or even the trains go through tunnels, but it's pretty much isolated other than these handful of conduits in. My house was up here, probably about a 45-minute drive away. So by way of background, 9/11 was not the first time that the World Trade Center was attacked. In fact, in 1993, a group of terrorists packed a van full of explosives and pulled into the parking garage under the World Trade Center and detonated it with the hope that they would be able to take the building down. They did do some damage. They killed about 6 people, injured about another 200 or so. But for me, that was the first sign that this may not be the only time that there's an attempt like this. And in fact, when I first started working there, I always, every day going into the office, I would reflect on the fact that something like this could happen at any time, and to always be aware and always be vigilant. Not like I was walking scared, but the thought was always deep in the back of my mind. So this was 15 years ago. This is what Brennan looked like back then. Quite a cute kid. So he was about 2.5 years old. I have to imagine that that at least half of you guys were not yet born when this happened. And those of you that were old enough probably don't really remember it. So for me, you know, it all started like a regular, normal day. This is what New York City, or at least the downtown area, looked like from New Jersey. Here's your Hudson River. My company, I was working for a company known as Lehman Brothers, and this was kind of our corporate campus downtown. So this was 3 World Financial Center, which is where my company's headquarters was, and that's where my bosses were. This was 1 World Financial. This is where the business that I supported was. And then these are the 2 towers of the World Trade Center, otherwise known as the Twin Towers. The one with the antenna is known as Tower 1, or the North Tower. So north is this way, south is this way. And my office, my company had 38, 39, and 40 in this building. So this is where my office was. I had a whole bunch of colleagues that were on 38, 39, and 40. I was in the stairwell all the time because it's much easier to take the stairs than it would be to wait for an elevator in such a tall building. Each one of these had about 110 stories. So on September 11th, you know, it was a really gorgeous day. It was almost like the weather yesterday on the 15th anniversary, you know, just spectacularly clear. It was almost eerie how similar yesterday was to the way it was 15 years ago. Really just a gorgeous day. And for me, it all started as normal. This was, for me, the Saturday before this, I was at the US Open. It was my 5-year anniversary. You know, we had our 1 child. Life was good. Can you go forward? So this was the first email that I had sent. I got to work at 7:15 that day. You know, got my coffee, my muffin, kind of got all set. Sent an email to my wife. You know, as you can see, this is Brendan was 2.5 years, or you know, a little bit more than 2 years old. Yeah, about 2.5. You know, we had a great time playing with the choo-choos and reading and pointing at the circus animals, and you know, we said our prayers, and he said, "I love my mommy." You know, this was all just very, very, very normal. So then I started my conference call with colleagues in London, which started at 8 o'clock. And this was my standard Tuesday routine. I had a conference call at 8 o'clock with colleagues in London, and I would be on speakerphone. So it was a regular, normal day until this happened. So that, as you could see from the antenna on top, this was Tower 1. So this is the building that I was in. Now, luckily, this kind of happened a whole bunch of floors above me. So I was in the 40th floor, which is where my office was. This happened between floors 92 and 98. So although 50 some odd floors above me, I actually didn't hear it, but I felt it. And with my arms on the desk kind of started to rock, and I jumped out of my chair, and the wall behind me started to crack all the way down, and the ceiling above me started to flake down on me. My first thought was to hide under the desk so that if my ceiling collapsed, it wouldn't fall on me. But then my thought was, well, wait a second, this is an earthquake, and I'm on the 40th floor. And right around that time, I kind of looked, so my office backed up to the elevators, and outside of the window of my office were a whole bunch of people's cubicles, and beyond that were the windows to the outside. And I looked out on the people outside of my office, and they were all kind of looking around, so it was clear that it wasn't just me that felt what was going on. And within seconds, out of the window, I saw all sorts of debris showering down, and there were sheets of metal, there were lots of papers, there was equipment that was falling down, and it was very, very clear that something unnatural was happening at this point. So the fight or flight instinct kicked in, and I immediately fled, and I went to the stairs that I would normally go to. I didn't even think twice about it. I just ran. And as I ran, there were a lot of people that were still in the hallway and still at their desk, and I was screaming at everybody to get out, for everybody to follow me. So into the stairwell I went, and the very first thing that I did, right when I got into the stairwell, I used to have this. Remember, these were the days before smartphones, and there was no Facebook, Twitter, Snapchat. None of that existed. Cell phones existed, and this was my cell phone at the time, and it used to be clipped to my belt. So the very first thing I did right when I got into the stairwell was flipped it open and hit my wife's button, which was on speed dial, and I left a message for her. Unfortunately, it got to her voicemail, and I said, I don't know what's happening, but if I never see you and Brendan again, I love you dearly, send my love. And immediately hung up the phone, went to go call my mother, because I'm a bit of a mama's boy, just like Brendan, and sure enough, it went. The phone was dead, and none of the phones were working. So I was able to get one phone call off, and then the cell phone network in the whole area went out. So I was bolting down the stairs, and when I first got into the stairwell, there was nobody in the stairwell, and I probably got down 5 flights of stairs without any interference whatsoever. There was literally nobody in the stairwell. And then people started to funnel in, and it got a little bit slower and slower and slower until on the 28th floor, I came to an absolute stop. And there were jam-packed people below me, jam-packed people above me. There was nowhere for me to go. So on the 28th floor, I got stuck. So this was probably, I would say, maybe somewhere between 8 and 10 minutes in. What was interesting is that there was no mass hysteria. Like there was no stampede. People weren't crying. It was pure calm. Like nobody knew what was going on, but it was pure calm. And we all started kind of chattering, what in the world was that? What do we think it is? Because we all felt it. And we all just kind of concluded that a small plane must have hit one of the buildings. Because in New York in years prior, in the 70s and 80s, little small aircraft had run into the Empire State Building, so it wasn't completely unusual. So we just assumed that it was a small plane that ran into one of the buildings, but really had no clue. Meanwhile, my wife worked on the New Jersey side of the Hudson River, but right on the Hudson River. So here's where the World Trade Center is. Here's the Hudson River, and as you can see from the very first picture that I gave, if you're standing on the New Jersey side, you can see clearly right across it to everything. You can't quite throw a baseball across, but you can easily see across. She was stuck in traffic here, trying to get to her office here, watching as this happened. So she knew that I was in the building, one of the buildings that was on fire. She didn't know if I was actually in the one building at the time that was on fire, but she knew I was down there. But she didn't know much else at the time, and neither did we. So the way that we first started to get any type of information, because again, no cell phones were working, no such thing as the internet on everybody's cell phone, no tweets that could give us insight into what was happening, there was nothing. The only things that were actually working inbound were, we all had these little pagers. So pagers you may see doctors wearing them nowadays too, or these beepers. Like very few people use these nowadays. But back at the time, there were these news services that would send information to it. And there was news, sports, weather, business news. So all of a sudden, a breaking news alert came across the pager. And the wording was such that a plane has crashed into one of the towers of the World Trade Center, which for all the people that were around us, we just kind of just reinforced everything that we knew. So at this point, it was just a matter of getting ourselves down to the bottom and figuring out when we'd all be able to go back in and get all of our stuff. But then minutes later, this happened. So this was now the other building. So while I was in the first building on the 28th floor, the other building was hit by an airplane. And this time it was a little bit lower. This time it was between floors 78 and 84. So as you can see, it's a little bit lower in the building. Now, mind you, I was still about 20 floors beneath this, or I'm sorry, about 50 floors beneath this, but boy, did I feel it. I heard it, felt it. The whole entire building rocked that I was in. At this point, there was a little bit of crying and whimpering, but still no major stampede to get out. We all thought that there was just some sort of explosion that was kind of a follow-on to the plane that hit our building. But then minutes later, another breaking news story came across. And this time, the wording was very different, and the wording scared the hell out of me. The wording this time was, the second tower has been hit by an airplane. So at this point, it was really crystal clear that this was no accident, that the city was under attack. And I figured that the city was completely under siege. And on the 28th floor, my mind started racing and wandering, and I had visions of militants on the street with machine guns and grenades and bazookas, and there being car bombs going off all over the place. I was envisioning that there was craziness that was happening on the street. So if I were to make it out, I was trying to formulate a plan in my head of what would I do, what will I do when I ultimately get down. So very shortly thereafter, there were calls from beneath that were saying, everybody get to the side, firefighters are coming up. So lots of firefighters started to, we all kind of crept to the side to allow the firefighters up. And there were a lot of firefighters that came in, and boy, they were going up, and they were carrying all sorts of, the fire retardant outfit alone is very, very heavy. And then they had oxygen tanks and hoses and axes, and these poor guys, these heroes, were going up as I was trying to get down. And one by one, these guys passed me, giving us reassuring statements. You guys are all going to be okay. Everything's going to be okay. One by one, they would turn the 28th floor, look me in the eye, and then go up. And these guys, these brave souls, unfortunately, all ended up going down with the buildings. A lot of them. But while they're reassuring to us that we're going to be okay, the only devices, you guys have probably never seen this before, but you've probably heard of BlackBerry. So BlackBerry is now the smartphone that nobody wants to have. But back then, the early BlackBerries, and this device was about this big. Although cell phones weren't working, these devices, which were a way to send wireless email, were the only ones that were actually working at the time. And in my company, we all had these as a means of communicating with one another while we were on the go. Mine was sitting charging on my desk, but a guy that was right near me that I worked with had his clipped to his belt, so I was able to get an email off to my wife. And this is the email that I sent. So I'm in the stairwell. Firemen say I'm going to be okay. I'll call you when I'm definitely safe. I love you and Brennan more than you can imagine. Notice the time, 9:15 in the morning. So I'd now been in the stairwell for just about a half hour. Firefighters telling me I'm going to be okay, but still in my mind, the whole city's under attack, and what in the world do I do when I get out? So meanwhile, my wife was on the New Jersey side of the river in her office, looking out the window across the river, seeing that both buildings were on fire, now knowing that I was in the stairwell. So then back to the stairwell. We finally started to be able to make our way down the stairwell. And at first it was like one step every 5 seconds. And then it was about one step every second. And then finally, I was able to actually walk as if you're walking down the steps. By the time I got to about the 6th floor, all of the fire sprinklers were on, and there was glass everywhere from people breaking glass to get the hoses out and get the axes out. And at this point, so I was now starting to be able to walk. At this point, I started to hear these sounds, these whistling sounds, these shoo, shoo. And in my mind, these were grenades that were going off. So for the remaining floors, I got my plan down pat. I know exactly what I'm going to do. When I get to the ground floor, I'm going to bolt to the door that I normally get to go to the other buildings of the World Financial Center complex, and then I'm going to head uptown, and I'm going to hide behind every garbage truck, every garbage dumpster, every building. I'm going to hide inside of doorways, just running from these militants that are going to be on the street. So meanwhile, while all this was happening, and I was a little bit oblivious to this at the time, but there was yet a third airplane that had crashed, and this one crashed into the Pentagon. And this was all while, just about at the time that I was getting ready to get out of the building, but I had no idea that this was happening. I wasn't staring at my pager at the time. When I finally got out, when I finally got to the ground floor, and this was now just about 55 minutes after I first entered the stairwell, I executed my plan and I bolted for the door that I would normally go to. And there was an emergency worker that stopped me there, and all the glass was blown out, so I just kind of walked through the revolving door and then ran to the door, and there was somebody there sending me back through the mall. So the mall of the World Trade Center, there were the Twin Towers, and in the subfloor beneath it was this very elaborate shopping mall, a very, very high-end shopping mall. But I couldn't for the life of me understand why I was being sent back into it, where all I wanted to do was get to the door that was nearest me. So I went back through the mall, just following directions, and at this point there was about 6 inches deep of water, and all of the fire sprinklers were on, and all of the windows of every store that was in the mall were completely blown out. So, running through all the water, getting showered on, I finally made my way to the opposite side of the mall, where there was an escalator that I was able to walk up and finally see the light of day. And when I finally got out, I looked up, I looked across the street, and there were 8 people or so deep of spectators looking up at the building. So your first natural instinct is to look up at what they're looking at, and I saw the 2 towering infernos at the time, and then I ran. My basic instinct was just get the hell out of here, run as fast as you possibly can. So I navigated through the 8 or so people that were lining the street, and I just ran. And I sprinted until I hit a dead end, and I turned until I hit a dead end, and then I turned, and I just kept kind of zigzagging until I ran out of steam, and I started walking. And within minutes after I started walking, I heard this really loud rumble behind me. Since I was 6 blocks away and kind of isolated via buildings, I didn't know what it was. In my mind, this was a bomb that's going off, so I immediately went back into a sprint. And as I was sprinting down the street, coincidentally, I passed a synagogue where there was a rabbi waving me in and waving other people in that were running. So a handful of us got into the synagogue with this loud rumble behind me. For me, this was a bit of a hiding place. But while I was in there, I asked the rabbi if I could use a phone. None of the phone systems were really working all that well. I still wasn't able to communicate with my wife. And I kind of peeked open the door after the noise subsided, and I asked a passerby, what was that sound? And he said, one of the buildings just fell. One of the World Trade Center buildings just fell. And at that point, your mind starts to play tricks on you again, and I started to wonder, oh my gosh, what will now the new skyline look like with only one building? And oh my gosh, who was near the building that is now caught in the rubble of it? So that was a bit of a surreal moment for me when I heard that. So this is what my journey looked like when I got out of the building. So that's where the World Trade Center was. I kind of zigzagged back and forth. That's ultimately where I ran to, which is right by the Brooklyn Bridge. Meanwhile, there was yet a 4th plane that ultimately was crashed. Now, the story behind this one, this was an airplane that was intended to go to the U.S. Capitol. And this was the fourth one after the two towers had been hit and the Pentagon was hit. And the passengers that were on this plane, and all four of the planes started on the East Coast and were meant to be cross-country flights to get a lot of fuel on them, because the fuel obviously burns much better. The more fuel, the bigger the fire. That's what the terrorists had devised. So this ultimately was intended for the Capitol. So it had already made the turn. The passengers that were on this plane were able to communicate with the ground, and they knew that their plane was hijacked because the hijackers took over the airplane. And what they heard from the ground is that these other planes were hijacked and crashed into landmarks. So the passengers aboard this flight actually took the plane back from the hijackers and intentionally crashed it in a rural area in a field in Pennsylvania to avoid this from being able to be used as a weapon against the White House or the Capitol. So a few minutes later, from where I was in the synagogue, I heard that loud rumbling noise again, which unfortunately this time was familiar. So it was clear that the other building was falling. And at this point, going back to the email that I sent my wife, she thought that I was still in one of the two burning buildings in the stairwell. So at this point, she has now seen both buildings fall, expecting that I was in one of the buildings and perishing. So at this point, there was now a big stampede in the street. And there was a bit of a stampede the first time, but this time I really, really heard the stampede. So the rabbi of the synagogue made everybody leave. We all had to leave. We all had to evacuate. The rabbi said everybody has to get out of here. So completely soaking wet from all of the sprinklers that I had gone through, I now walked out into this, which was a big dust cloud, soot, debris, all sorts of toxins from everything in these two buildings now incinerating and spreading outward. So really dust had enveloped the entire area. This is what I looked like. I felt a little bit like a papier-mâché doll because I had all this stuff now stuck to me after being soaking wet. So we were all kind of covered head to toe in ash. Not everybody was soaking wet, but we were all kind of covered. And now it was time to figure out how to get home, but again, in my mind, trying to dodge everything that could ultimately attack me or blow up near me. So that's where I started. That's where the World Trade Center was. When I ran, this is where I ended, which was right by the Brooklyn Bridge. But ultimately, I had to make my way up there, and I knew I needed to stay away from any major landmark, any bridge, any tunnel, Empire State Building, whatever it was. I knew I wanted to stay away from it because in my mind, the city was completely under siege. And I didn't yet know about the other two planes. What I also didn't know at the time was that there was a major ground stop. No airplanes were allowed to take off anymore. But in my mind, these planes were going to be constant. And as I was walking through the streets of Manhattan, I kept hearing airplanes. I couldn't see them, but I kept hearing airplanes. And in my mind, it was yet another attack that was about to happen. Turned out that those were F-16 fighters that were way above the clouds. You can hear them, but you can't see them. But it really scared me. So finally, along the journey, now as I was making my 4-mile trip up to the ferry, north to the ferry, along the way, I kind of buddied up with somebody else that looked like they were covered in head-to-toe ash that had just gone through what I did. I said, let's walk together. We were walking the majority of the time. And that was, while we were walking, was when I started to hear all of the other reports of the other airplanes that were crashed, and all the other things that were happening. But the significance of him is we were able to finally get to a payphone. Although I was still not able to get in touch with my wife, he was able to get in touch with his wife in New Jersey, who was able to get in touch with my wife. And at about 12:15, my wife finally found out that I was actually still alive. So for about an hour and 45 minutes, she was wondering what life was going to be like without me. So then finally, about 15 minutes later, we arrived at the ferry terminal. So this is about 12:30 in the afternoon. And we had to take a ferry because all of the roads, all the tunnels, bridges, train, nothing was running. In fact, the roads were intentionally cleared so that emergency vehicles could make their way through the streets to bring any potential injured survivors to a hospital. So all the roads were cleared, and the only way across was either swimming or taking a ferry or some sort of boat. So at around 1:30, I finally got on a boat across the river, which, can you advance the slide? Was a very, very somber experience. So there were about 500 people on the boat with me, and nobody said a peep. You know, for this 10-minute boat ride across the river, we were all just looking at now the new skyline, which didn't include the two towers, and not a person said a word on it. It was really the most somber boat ride I had been on. So when I finally got to the other side, so this is now Hoboken, New Jersey, which is just on the other side of the Hudson River, and again, you can see how kind of close it all is. There was a makeshift trauma center that was set up, and what they were trying to do is treat the wounded. So with this, they took my health vitals and looked at my eyes and listened to my breathing. But what also happened in Hoboken was I went through what they called the decontamination process. So by this time I had dried, but still covered head to toe in soot and ash. And there was also a fear that there were biological and chemical agents that were on the airplanes, aside from all the toxins that we were exposed to with the buildings falling. So we all sat under a fire hose for about 60 seconds. So we were brought into a train terminal, an empty train terminal, where there was a fire truck who just literally hosed us down for about 60 seconds. Not the most pleasant experience. So at this point, again, I was soaking wet. And then we finally got on the train on the way home, which was a very, very, very long, very quiet, very emotional ride home. I finally got home around 4 o'clock in the afternoon on 9/11. And my wife was able to leave her office finally at around 3 o'clock. Again, they were kind of leaving all of the roads open. They didn't want any civilians in the road because they didn't want any traffic to prevent any of the emergency vehicles. So I finally was able to meet up with my wife and Brendan around 4 o'clock in the afternoon. However, we immediately had to get to work because we had my corporate campus, we had about 5,000 people down there. We had to account for 5,000 people. We had to figure out if there was anyone that was lost, where all of our staff was. So with the phone systems not working all that well, it was actually quite a challenging process to try and account for all the staff. I had about 40 people that were working for me at the time. So we spent probably until about midnight accounting for the staff. And then the very next day, we all had to report to work at 6 o'clock in the morning to get the business back up and running. Since we had so many people that were displaced, for us it was really 5 days of around-the-clock working to try and just resuscitate the business and get us back up and running for when the stock market opened again. I was working for a financial company that my business was very oriented around the stock market. What also happened that day, so this is now the day after, many, many, many volunteers, thousands of volunteers from all around the country came to help with the rescue efforts and the recovery efforts. And what this was is just trying to peel away, when the buildings fell and they collapsed into the middle, this became known as the pile. So the rescue and recovery effort was to try and sift through the pile and find survivors and get them to help as quickly as possible. So thousands of people from all over the place descended upon New York to try and sift through the pile and help with the recovery efforts while I was trying to work to get our business back up and running. Can you advance? So unfortunately, all in, only about 20 survivors were found in the wreckage. So what was a rescue effort kind of became a recovery and cleanup effort. The pile continued to smolder for about 100 days. So at this point, I started to work on the New Jersey side of the river, and every day you'd go in and you'd see the smoke hovering over the downtown area, which was the smoldering pile. For literally 100 days, that fire burned, and it took about 9 months ultimately to clean up the wreckage. So then it became a time for a lot of re's. The very first thing was reflection. Mr. Green, I see you out there. Anyone here of Bruce Springsteen? Anyone know who Bruce Springsteen is? Not enough. So Bruce Springsteen is a musical artist who likes to tell stories, and he actually happens to be from New Jersey. So in the 2001 to 2002 timeframe, he came out with an album known as The Rising, and this was all about the World Trade Center. So if you've ever heard the song The Rising, come on up for the rising. This is about a firefighter ascending the steps of the World Trade Center to try and save people. And in fact, the whole album is all about people, about loss, about firefighters going in, about the New York City skyline being now an empty sky, a city in ruins. So if you ever get a chance to listen to this album, just reflect upon the 9/11 time, because this album is all about it. But then it became time to show our resilience. So in 2006, after the cleanup effort had now been fully completed, we began work on what is now known as the Freedom Tower. So we started rebuilding the New York area, the downtown New York area. So in 2014, the new Freedom Tower, which is now the new Tower 1 of the World Trade Center with the spire on top of it, reopened. And to me, this is a symbol of America's determinism, that no matter what you do, you're not going to keep us down. We will overcome all adversity. So this is really a key symbol of the resilience of America. And then almost 10 years later, our Navy SEALs finally found the mastermind behind the attacks, Osama bin Laden. We found him in Pakistan and killed him and brought him to justice. So this was the next re, which is revenge. And then it became a time for remembrance. So if you've ever been to the downtown area where the World Trade Center used to be, there's now the 9/11 Memorial, which is a very well-done museum. It's actually quite a large museum, which kind of reflects all on the day and all on the people who lost their lives and the messages that the people that were trapped had left for their loved ones. It's really a very sobering experience. And then where the two towers of the World Trade Center used to sit are now these very elegant reflecting pools. So these are almost like waterfalls. And they're in the footprint of what used to be the two towers of the World Trade Center. So this is zooming in a little bit, and you could see really, I mean, these are people lining. You could see actually how large they really are. And around the outside of it, engraved in the walls, are all the names of the fallen. So all in, 2,977 innocent civilians were killed that day. And you could see that they kind of range from people that were in and around the World Trade Center. You know, I have to imagine this number is not just the people that were in the building, but unfortunately those people that I sifted through in order to run, I have to imagine that there are many spectators that are also in this number, because once those buildings started to fall, there was really no running from it. It was like an avalanche. And then each of the planes that went down, and then of course the 125 people that were killed in the Pentagon. So in this number also is 411 first responders. So these are the firefighters, the policemen, the EMTs that were going in to save people like me, going into the eye of the storm as I was trying to run out of it. So key messages to take away. First one is the one of vigilance and awareness. So this was a sign of terrorism. The 1993 bombing was a sign of terrorism. Unfortunately, there were the attacks in San Bernardino. There were the attacks in Orlando. Not to frighten people, but it is a little bit of a new normal. You just have to simply be aware of your surroundings. If you see something unusual, alert authorities. This can happen anywhere. So, obviously, I don't know if a September 11th style attack can happen so easily anymore, but just be aware of your surroundings and bring it to the authorities. The sign of resilience, and this is something that I want all of you to take away. I mean, so America rebounded very quickly after the September 11th attacks, but you should all take this away personally. If you ever get knocked down, just bounce right back up again. Don't let anyone hold you down. We have to respect our first responders. These are the people that were going in to save me. They're all heroes. These are people that risk their lives to save innocent people like me, as are the armed forces. So these are the people that are out in foreign lands helping to protect the very freedom that we enjoy every single day. And there are, unfortunately, other countries that are looking to take away our freedom, so we all have to respect our armed forces. Be proud to be an American. So this is the land of the free and the home of the brave. Those words are in the Star Spangled Banner. When you sing that song, when you pledge allegiance, remember this day and reflect on those words as you're saying it. And then lastly, never forget 9/11. So with that, I'll take questions. Who will be the first? Yes.
You still work for the same company?
Do I still work for the same company? So that will be the topic of yet another speech. So Lehman Brothers, unfortunately, went bankrupt in 2008, which was at the heart of the financial crisis. So no, I don't work for that same company anymore. That same company, unfortunately, doesn't exist anymore. Anyone else? Yeah. Were the people that work for me okay? So all in, my company lost one employee. So although we had about 5,000 people in the area and about 500 people in the building, we only lost one person. And that one person died. He was actually in the elevator at the time, trying to go up to his office, when these airplanes that were laden with jet fuel hit the buildings. You could see even in the videos that the other side of the building explodes out. The crash came across the elevator shafts. So flaming jet fuel shot down the elevator shafts. Anyone that was on the elevator, unfortunately, got scorched to death. And in fact, that was what made my walls crack. So my office backed up to the elevators, and it was the fireballs that shot down the elevators that ultimately made my walls crack. So we lost one person all in. Any other questions? Anyone know what the whistling sound was? So yes, unfortunately, what I had drawn in my mind to be grenades, which were the whistling and the crashing, these were people that were jumping from the floors above. And the whistling was just the sound of their bodies flying through the air and them hitting the ground. I had no idea that this was happening until at least 2 weeks later when the first documentary came out, and that sound, I heard the sound again, and I drew my attention to the TV, and the narrator mentioned that these were people that were jumping from the buildings. So about 200 people ended up jumping from the buildings because they felt like that fall to their death was better than the fire that was on their floor. And that was also why when I tried to escape the building, there was a security person sending me back through the mall because the door that I wanted to go through had people landing on the ground. There's another hand in the back before. Yeah? How much longer did I live in New York for? So we moved to Clarendon Hills in 2006, in the beginning part of 2006. So for almost 5 years, 4.5 to 5 years. And one of the questions from one of the prior sessions was, did I come here, kind of seeking a different place from the New York area because it was a terrorist target. And I would say that although I moved for career purposes, the thought was always in the back of my mind that maybe moving to the Midwest will be a little bit less of a target. Unfortunately, within months of being in my new office, which was diagonally across from the Sears Tower, news broke about, we eventually invaded a cave in Afghanistan where there was a computer that had blueprints on it for the Sears Tower. So evidently the Sears Tower was also one of the potential targets. And one of the other things I mentioned that there was a ground stop which stopped all of the airplanes from flying after those 4 planes crashed. I have to imagine that there were more airplanes that were set to go up that were prevented from it. So who knows how many other targets there were and how many other terrorist activities were actually scheduled for that day. Yeah.
How did you cope with everything after it happened?
How did I cope with everything afterwards? Well, I guess it was almost a blessing in disguise that we immediately had to go back to work. You know, it was almost like I didn't have time to think about it. So although, and I would say that even like the whole New York area, yeah, there was definitely a time for sorrow, but it was almost like all of us felt like we need to go and rebuild and get back to normal. So it was almost as if we kind of put off our coping mechanism to focus on the task at hand, which is rebuilding and getting back to normal. So I get the question a lot, do I have any post-traumatic stress? And I don't think I do. I think I have two lingering effects, and one of them is I simply don't like crowds. You know, I tend to get a little bit anxious when I'm in a crowd of people. I go to Union Station every day to go to work, and you know I kind of scurry out of the train station because I just don't like to be near crowds. And then the other thing is I'm very, very, very jumpy. So when people come upon me, I will jump out of my skin if they make a sudden movement or a sudden sound. So other than that, I was kind of like, I was kind of insulated because I was in the stairwell for the majority of the time. So I didn't see a lot of I didn't see the crashes. I didn't see a lot of the burning. I didn't see the people jumping. So it was almost like I was, the fact that I was insulated in the stairwell was able to keep me from having major post-traumatic stress. Yeah.
I sort of have two questions. One was, what was it like sort of running away, being taken over by the dust clouds and all the soot? And my second question was, I kind of forgot.
I'll come back to you after I answer the first one. So it was, you know, what were you thinking or feeling as you were running and got enveloped by the dust cloud? You know, it felt like a nuclear winter. You literally could not see. I couldn't see my hand in front of my face. You couldn't see anything. And it was really, really, really hard to breathe. But in my mind, I was very, very focused on just trying to get home. Like all I wanted to do was flee the area. You remember now?
Yeah. So did you ever go back, before you went back to business or anything like that? Like, was there ever a day when you actually went back into downtown and saw the debris?
I did, yeah, because so the question was, did I go back downtown and actually see any of the debris? And the One World Financial, which was one of those other two buildings, at some point a couple of months later, we were able to get into our building and collect some of our belongings. So I was able to go into that building and actually look down on the site. But for the most part, so I saw all the activities. I saw the pile smoldering. But for the most part, I began working out of one of the company's other offices. You know, one of the other things that was miraculous about the time is New York City, which is known to be, fiercely competitive, and I was working in a fiercely competitive industry. Right after 9/11 happened, all of the walls between people came down, and everybody was just bonding together to help one another, to help with the recovery efforts. Even my company's own direct competitors were offering their own office space to help us get back up and running because they knew we lost our offices. So it was really a miraculous time to be in New York. Any other questions? No? Okay, thank you guys.